Mark chapter 7 and verse 1. Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes, remember these are the ones that believed in this concept of tradition. Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. Now when they saw some of his disciples, that is, some of Jesus' disciples, eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. And then we have this explanation. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way. Holding, now here we have one of those key words. Holding here's another key word, the tradition of the elders. Verse 4, when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they have, now what's the next word? They have received and what? And hold. Do you see the terminology that is used here? That they have received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the, there it is again, tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? He answered and said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For, laying aside the commandment of God, now here comes the key word again, you what? You hold, and then again the key word, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do. He said to them, all too well you reject the commandment of God that you may keep, here's the word again, your tradition. And now Jesus is going to give an example of how they stick to tradition instead of to the written word of God. Notice what it says in verse 10. 10. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. That's a quotation from the writings of Moses. Verse 11. But you say, in other words, in contrast to Moses, you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is korban, that is, a gift of God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition, which you have what? Notice again, handed down, and many such things you do. Now let's examine this passage verse by verse and try and determine the meaning of what Jesus is saying to these religious leaders in his day. So let's go to verse 1 where it says, then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. Now the question is, why did these individuals come from Jerusalem? Why did the Pharisees and the scribes come from Jerusalem? In the Review and Herald, March 8, 1898, Ellen White explains the reason why these individuals were sent. This is how she explains it. This deputation, in other words, this group, was sent from Jerusalem for the express purpose of watching Jesus, that something might be found with which to accuse him. In other words, they were spying Jesus out to find some reason to accuse Jesus Christ. Now the question is, who were these leaders? Let me give you a summary of the types of people that they were, these scribes and Pharisees. First of all, we know that these individuals loved to receive recognition from the multitudes. In fact, their religion consisted mostly of externals, with the purpose of impressing the populace. We know, according to Jesus, if you read this in Matthew 23 and verse 7, that they really enjoyed and relished the idea of being called rabbi or teacher. They also loved to be called Father, interestingly enough. In fact, this led Jesus to say in Matthew 23 verse 9, Don't call any man on earth your father, because you have only one Father, your God who is in heaven. Also, we find in Matthew 23, verse 14, that Jesus described these religious leaders as devouring the material possessions of the widows. In other words, they were greedy. Also, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, as well as Matthew 23, verse 14, that these individuals loved to utter long prayers, repetitious prayers, to impress the people with their piety. And they loved to give alms in public so that people believed that they were extremely religious. These are the types of people that Jesus was dealing with in the scribes and in the Pharisees. And these were the ones that were sent to spy out Jesus, to find something to accuse him of. Now let's go to verse 2. Now when they saw some of his disciples, that is, some of the disciples of Jesus, eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. Now in a moment we're going to notice that this is not dealing with hygiene. This is not dealing with cleanliness. It's dealing with ceremonial washing. Let's go on to verses 3 and 4. It explains why they accused Jesus. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way. And in the Greek, that means frequently. In a special way, a better translation is they wash their hands frequently. And then notice, holding, that's one of our key words, holding the tradition, that's another one of our key words, holding the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they have, here comes the key word again, have received, and another key word, and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. Now this accusation has nothing to do with hygiene. It has nothing to do with physical cleanliness. We all know that when we come to the table, we are supposed to wash our hands before we eat. But this issue does not have anything to do with washing your hands before a meal. This is dealing with ritual or ceremonial cleansing. It's a religious ritual cleansing that is being spoken of here. It's not talking about washing your hands before you eat. Now, I don't know whether you noticed, but 3 times in this passage, Jesus makes it very clear that this issue of washing was only the tip of the iceberg. Because there were many other such things. It says 3 times, Jesus says, there are many other things, many other such things that you do because of tradition. In other words, the washing issue was only one of many practices that they based on tradition. Now, I want you to notice the technical terminology. I know that I've underlined this, but it's important that we underline it again. Notice in chapter 7 and verse 3, it speaks about the holding to the tradition of the elders. Technical terms that we read from Josephus, we read from George Footmore, and we read from Marcel Simon. They use these identical terms to describe Jewish tradition in the days of Christ. Also in chapter 7 and verse 4, we have the expression which they have received to hold. In other words, they receive it by transmission and they hold it. In chapter 7 and verse 5, it speaks about the tradition of the elders. In chapter 7 and verse 8, they hold. Notice once again the key term. They hold the tradition of men. Verse 9 says, your tradition. And in chapter 7 and verse 13, it speaks about the tradition which you have handed down. Now let me ask you, the expression received and handed down, does that have an idea of transmitting? Of course it does. Handed down means that they got it from previous generations, and received means that they've received it. And what do? They hold it. They hold these traditions because they believe that it's part of the deposit of tradition that God supposedly gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. Now, regarding this idea of the tradition of the elders that is used several times in this passage, the Jerome Bible Commentary, which interestingly enough is a Roman Catholic commentary, has this to say about the expression tradition of the elders, which is used several times in this passage. It explains, this is a rabbinical term for the body of what? For the body of unwritten laws that the Pharisees considered as equally binding as the written Torah. So what was this expression, the tradition of the elders? What does that mean? It means, according to this Roman Catholic commentary, a rabbinical term, that's a term of the rabbis, for the body of unwritten laws, this is oral tradition, that the Pharisees considered as equally binding as the written Torah. Now, Ellen White described this mass of tradition that existed in the days of Christ. In Manuscript Releases, volume 20 and page 338, she explains about these traditions that were held by the religious leaders. She says this, when Christ came to this world, he found the Jewish people burdened with a heavy weight of traditions and ceremonies, which the religious teachers had what? Had handed down. See the terminology? Had handed down, and then she explains what? From generation to generation. Are you catching the nuance of what this view is? From generation to generation, and then she says, so great was the mass of tradition brought in that the commandments of God were made of none effect. A mass of oral traditions. All of these oral traditions supposedly were given to Moses at Mount Sinai. And in each generation, the living voice or the magisterium would take some of these oral traditions that had been preserved and they would bring them forth and would say, this was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. But you could not find these things in the writings of Moses. They were supposedly brought forth by the religious leaders in succeeding generations.